Hello, my name is Carlos Freck. I am the Communications and Advocacy Manager at NAMI Racine County and your host today. In today's episode, we are having a conversation with Mary Buchaklian, Human Resources Specialist, about how to navigate appropriate and reasonable accommodations for mental illness, how to ask them from your employer, and how people who live with a mental illness can advocate for themselves. Welcome to Compassionate Conversations, the podcast produced by the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI Racine County, discussing subjects related to mental health and mental illness. Hi, Mary. Welcome to Compassionate Conversations.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me today.
Mary, would you mind introducing yourself to our listeners?
Hi, my name is Mary. I am a Human Resources Manager, and I've been in the field for about 5 years now. I went to the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, graduated with a Bachelor's of Business Administration with a major in Human Resources. And I also am a board member for NAMI Racine. I've been on the board for about a year now.
A year.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for what you do. Now, getting into our conversation today, mental health conditions have important impact on various aspects of life. Certainly, productivity is one of those aspects. When is it appropriate to talk to your employer about accommodations for mental health?
I feel it is appropriate to talk to your employer when you feel that your condition is affecting your ability to perform your job duties. It is important to communicate your needs clearly to your employer and work with them to come up with a plan that works for both parties. I would familiarize yourself with your company's policies regarding accommodations for your mental health conditions.
Now, as you know, the Americans with Disabilities Act and other anti-discrimination laws establish that most employers must provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities. And however, mental illness is not necessarily an apparent condition, and employers do not always know how to accommodate for it. So, how do employees with mental health conditions can advocate for themselves preventively in order to avoid a mental crisis?
I would say employees with mental illness conditions can advocate for themselves preventively by proactively engaging with their employers and their HR managers to discuss the potential accommodations and ways to manage their condition. Some things you could do is educate yourself and how it affects your work performance. You can identify your job-related challenges that your condition may create. You can schedule a conversation with your HR manager to discuss your needs. You could also, I would do is provide documentation, medical documentation to your employer, and then be sure to always have that conversation with HR, follow up on how you're doing, and then always to remember to approach those types of conversations with a positive and collaborative attitude.
Then you would recommend that if I was living, I don't know, with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or any other major mental illness, that I would be forward, go with that information to HR. Because I'm thinking that most people who are listening to this might think, well, if I do that, that might put me in a different position to the rest of the employees. But you think that that will still be a good idea, because if you are in a good place in your mental health journey, you certainly want to avoid being in a crisis, and that crisis would affect your performance. So then it's better to be open and honest with HR.
I think it's best to just be open and honest with your employer.
Well, thank you for that, because I think it's certainly important, even though we might be afraid of revealing certain situations in our journey. It is important to be open and honest so that there are no negative consequences. Now, what would you recommend employers implement, that they could implement to improve the employees' mental health and work-life balance? And especially those who live with a mental illness, because there is certainly, a mental health. We all have mental health to take care of. And our workplace is an important part of, or plays an important part in our mental health. But those who live with a specific mental illness may be in a different situation and in a different condition. So what do you think would be ideal for employers to adapt as far as policies to help protect the mental health of their employees?
I think employers can implement a positive work environment to help improve that mental health illnesses and a work-life balance by fostering a culture of inclusivity and support, and then encouraging open communication and providing opportunities for feedback by employees. And then I also think that employers could provide mental health resources such as employee assistance programs and stress management workshops. It's important to educate your employees and everyone in your company or organization on the available resources and encourage them to seek the help when they need it.
That last part, I think, is very interesting because I feel, and this is probably has a lot to do with the stigma around mental illness, but I do feel that we are not really open to talking about mental health in general. Because every time we talk about mental health with people, we somehow assume that it's mental illness. Even though they're not the same. Somebody who lives with a mental illness could be mentally healthy. So I think we all have this fear of talking about mental illness. But if we put it out in a workplace as a policy, as in this is for everybody, I might have a specific need that other people don't. But in general, the work culture supports all employees' mental health. And human resources is certainly not my specialty. But in my experience, and what leadership studies say, is that taking care of employees not only improves productivity, but also your connection with the company. So let me ask you this. If you were to say 2 or 3 main policies that you think are important to maintain the life-work balance, what would you say they are?
I think it's everyone is different and you handle each situation in a different way depending on people's needs. I think it's important to promote a positive work culture and then encourage self-care as well. And some places and organizations do wellness programs as well. And I think that's really beneficial.
Yeah, I think actually after COVID or that the pandemic changed the game for a lot of companies, the way they look at their employees. Perhaps before that happened as well. But I think COVID showed everybody that there is a different game now and that the need for mental health is even higher now than it was before.
It is higher than ever.
And on this, one complicated issue of living with a mental illness is certainly the inability to predict when a crisis might happen. Still, in some cases, it is possible to recognize triggers and symptoms of a potential crisis. So, what would you recommend an employee to do when they feel a crisis might be coming up or might be disruptive to their performance?
I think it would be important to seek help by maybe calling a crisis helpline or calling your mental health provider. I also think it's important that you should maybe take that time off, use some sick time or available vacation time. I also think it's important to prioritize your mental health and take the steps you need to manage a crisis effectively by seeking help and communicating.
Now, and again, this changes from company to company. But if I felt that there was a crisis coming, I mean, I'm not in a crisis, but I can see the triggers, so I can feel it coming. Is there any accommodations that could be taken at work outside of taking paid time off? Anything that could be done at work to help me prevent the crisis?
I think you should talk with your employer right away when you feel something that may be coming up and try and work something out together and make a plan.
Right, and it's obviously important that we know ourselves enough to recognize the triggers and when a crisis might be coming up. Now, outside of work, there is always therapy, and that I believe that should be the go-to, the first option. But at work, we said before that you should be open with your employer, and that you should talk to HR about your situation, especially if you feel that something like this might be coming up. But in that, should I go and say, well, look, I'm feeling this way right now. This might be interrupting my capacity to work. And can we ask for help? Is there anything that our employer could do for us in order to avoid a crisis?
I think that it would be important to communicate what's going on and how you're feeling with your employer or HR, so that they know what is going on and what is happening. And then they can help assist you with resources you may need, such as like an employee assistance program or a crisis helpline if you need something like that.
Okay, so the Employee Assistance Program, or EAP, is this common in all companies? Or should we expect that every company has this?
It just depends. Some organizations and companies may offer it, some may not.
So the first step is to find out if the company actually does have it.
Yep. So I would definitely review what your company or organization offers. So familiarize yourself with those kinds of things that your company does offer, and then go talk to your employer. Or if you don't know, you can always talk to your employer as well, and they can tell you about it.
Yeah, and I think that everybody should do this, but especially if you live with a condition that could be disruptive.
It's better to be proactive.
Another prevalent problem with mental illness is the stigma associated with it. So people might hesitate to share this information with their employers to avoid being perceived as unable to work, or to be perceived as that they don't perform satisfactorily. Now, what could the employer do to create a stigma-free culture so that people who live with a mental illness can feel free to share their concerns about their own mental health without fear of retribution?
I think creating a stigma free culture at work can help employees feel comfortable sharing their mental health conditions and concerns. I believe it's important to educate both your managers, leads, and employees about mental health, which includes common mental health conditions, and to be able to provide those resources and training on how to support colleagues with those mental health conditions. I would also encourage that open communication about mental health within your workplace. And then not only that, but to lead by example. Encourage leaders and managers to speak openly about their mental health and to model that positive behavior.
Now, that is a very important point. And I think at the beginning, we were talking about how the law does protect those who live with a certain disability. Even though mental illness might not be obvious. But would you say that that's also a safety net for those who live with a mental illness, and that they know that the law will protect them from discrimination?
That is where the Americans with Disability Act comes into play. So, to not discriminate, I also think it's important that you provide that medical documentation to your employer so you both can work out a plan.
Right. So I want to reiterate this because I believe this is very important. That you have to be proactive with your own situation and with your employers, so that they know that it could happen. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen. You might never have a crisis again, but there is always the possibility, and that you should be able to feel free and to feel safe with sharing this information with your employer. And perhaps it's the most important step that you could take to safeguard your performance at work, right?
Right. It is important to be proactive and get that information you need to your employer right away, so you feel better about your situation, and to always openly communicate with them as well. I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Well, there is this thing. We discussed this previously, that there is no way that anybody can predict when a person might have a mental health crisis. And when that happens, people need some time to stabilize and recover. From the human resources perspective, how could an employer effectively accommodate for that employee so that they have the time they need to recover and that is not detrimental to their status as an employee?
I think it's important to have and create those clear policies and guidelines. Also, by providing those mental health resources to those employees, such as the Employee Assistance Program, which we mentioned previously, and then also working with that employee to develop a plan, have that plan set in place.
It never occurred to me actually that it would be important for somebody, and especially for somebody living with a mental illness, to actually talk to your employer and say, well, I live with this condition, this might happen, and these are the things that we could do to when this starts to happen. Or at least say, this might happen to me, and how can we work this out if I need time off or whatever the situation might be. I don't think most people think about this, and I believe it's important to actually know that they could do that and to feel the freedom of having this type of plans and this type of conversations with their employers.
Yeah, feeling supported is huge. I think it's important that, again, you provide that medical documentation to your employer, and then you talk with them and sit down on a plan on how you can move forward and how you can better yourself and your mental health condition.
As I listen to you, it occurs to me that there are so many people who live with a mental illness but are successful at whatever they do. They have careers, they own companies, and so on. And I just think that these kind of conversations could create more empathy to those who live with mental illness and those who don't. And I think as we see more employers look at employees as people, as partners, and not just you work for me, but we are in a team. We are working together. The mentality of investing on all employees' mental health is also an investment on their company, and it changes the way the relationship between the employee and the employer, and also the way the employee looks at their own employer and how they feel at the job.
It's important because you have the same goals and objectives to get the same work done and kind of work done. So it's important to remember to be open and honest.
Mary, then what would you recommend to employees who live with a mental illness? What would you recommend they request from their employers to remain mentally healthy? And what kind of accommodations will they consider appropriate for them?
If an employee is living with a mental illness and needs accommodations to remain healthy at work, there are many steps that you can take to request accommodations. First, I would be open and honest about your mental health condition and illness and how it affects your ability to work. Explain why the accommodations are necessary and how they will help you become more productive and effective at work. Also, provide that medical documentation from your healthcare provider that explains your condition. Work with your human resources department. Then you can collaborate with your employer to determine which accommodations are appropriate and feasible, and then work together to find those solutions. And then also, I recommend to communicate regularly with your employer on how you're doing and how your journey is going. And then it is important to remember that the specific accommodations needed will vary depending on the individual and their mental health condition. Being open and honest, providing medical documentation, and working with HR.
Mary, thank you for spending this time with us and sharing all this information. Is there anything else you would like to say to our audience?
I just want to say thank you for having me, and I'm happy to be here.
Well, I want to thank you again for being here and for sharing all this information with us. And also thank you to our listeners for being there and for your support. This was Carlos Freck with Mary Buchaklian. Until our next compassionate conversation. Compassionate Conversations is brought to you in a partnership with United Way of Racine County. Thank you for your support. NAMI Racine County is a local affiliate of the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Our vision is to create a compassionate community where all people affected by mental illness live healthy, fulfilling lives. NAMI Racine County provides advocacy, education, support, and public awareness so that all individuals and families affected by mental illness can build better lives. Visit us at www.namiracinecounty.org for more information on mental health and related activities.